Believe it or not, in the spring I will have been at Metropolitan for 5 years. In one way, it feels like the blink of an eye. In another, an eternity. When someone is discerning becoming a minister in the United Church of Canada, one of the first questions church representatives ask is, tell us about your call. Why do you think you are called by God to do this work? What does that call look like, feel like? Where do you think it is leading you? They are trying to determine if we are going into ministry for the right reasons, and also make us really think about and articulate how we believe God is at work in our lives. Once we pass all the poking and prodding by the church and the theological education is complete and a ministry position is secured, this call story often makes its way into an early sermon as a way of saying to the congregation, here's who I am. Here's why I think Christ has led me here. Here's what I believe we are called by God to do together as a community of faith. But after almost 5 years here, I haven't done this yet. I've danced around it at various times, and if you dig into the sermon archives, you will hear me talking about experiences I had on the Camino de Santiago in Spain, where Christ very directly reached into my life. But that wasn't the moment of call. It came later, and I've never spoken about it from this pulpit. I suppose part of me is afraid of being judged. Another part is worried that you might think that I think I'm something special, which please know, I absolutely do not. Then there's another part of me that still questions the validity of my call, whether what happened to me was really a call of the divine, or just my ego manifesting something, or perhaps even a trick of the adversary trying to lead me astray. I suppose I will always have doubts and fears, but I have learned that having doubts and fears is part of having an authentic faith. I know that when dogmatic certainty sets in, we stop growing in faith and become prone to fundamentalism. Having faith, authentic faith, means moving forward with faith, believing in God's good intentions for us, even amidst doubts in ourselves and fears of what others might think. I've been hesitant to talk about my call, but today feels different. Today, the gospel text beckons us to take risks of faith for the sake of manifesting God's kingdom. Today is Stewardship Sunday, which is about having faith that God will magnify what we offer for God's good purposes. And today we celebrated a baptism. Malachi was baptized today, and you will soon see why that is significant. And so today I think it is time to take a risk and to say, here's who I am. Here's why I think Christ has led me here. Here's what I believe we are called by God to do together as a community of faith. I grew up as a very quiet kid in a very small town in rural Saskatchewan in an entirely unreligious household. I didn't even step foot inside of a church for worship until I was 33 years old, not even for a wedding or a funeral. And yet from childhood, I felt this craving for something deeper, something more. I believe we are hardwired for spirituality, but for most of my life, I had no outlet, no vocabulary for it. I was able to function and be successful in the world without that outlet and vocabulary until a time that I wasn't. I know many of you have experienced crisis points in your life where something happens that changes everything. For me, it was a breakup of my first marriage. It shattered me, stripped me of identity, made me question everything. I was cracked open. But as Brother Cohen says, that's how the light gets in. I was too broken to discern a way forward for myself with logic or reason, but I started getting these nudges in certain directions, and I just kind of went with it. I knew I needed to move from where I was living, and given my work at that time, I could have moved anywhere in the world with an internet connection, but I just knew somehow that I needed to be in Toronto. And then there was the big nudge to go and walk the Camino de Santiago, and then the beautiful nudge into a new relationship with my now wife, Brianne. She grew up in the United Church, and together we were nudged towards joining Rosedale United Church. And there I experienced firsthand and for the first time how being part of a supportive Christian community could be part of my healing and a new identity. I was starting to recompile, and I felt the nudge to give something back. I've always been a walker, and in the spring of 2011, Brianne and I came up with this idea where I would walk the whole Bruce Trail here in Ontario, all 900 kilometers of it. And Brianne, who was a folk singer, would meet me in various places along the way and play fundraising concerts for the MS Society of Canada. My mom has MS. We called it He Walks, She Rocks. I walked for 33 days, and Brianne played 7 shows, and we raised $11,000 for MS research. That's what we put on the press releases. But something else happened along the way. On May 8th, 2011, something happened that would change the direction of my life. I had been walking about 20 days at that point, long enough for my body and heart to completely open to the experience. I was up near Meadford, close to Georgian Bay, and if you've ever spent any time up there in the spring, you know that May snowstorms are definitely a thing. And that's what happened on May 8th. The day started with rain, which turned to snow, and then the wind came, and before long it was a full-on blizzard, and I was not prepared for it. I didn't have the proper gear, and as the day went on, I kept getting wetter and colder. I knew I couldn't stay out there, so I found my way to a country road, and I called the host of the place I was staying that night and asked him to please come and get me. He said, "No problem. I'll be there in 45 minutes." So I was there, standing on the road in a blizzard, getting wetter and colder, and I started to walk to try to warm up. And then I saw something. Through the snow, there was a cross and a steeple. It was a church. Now, for the previous 20 days, whenever I saw a church near the trail, I would get this irresistible urge to go and try and open the door. Up until that point, though, all the doors had been locked. But I felt somehow that this door would be different. So I went and I put my hand on the knob and I turned it, and it opened. I stepped into the foyer and wiped the snow from my glasses and looked around. I looked around and saw a kid's stroller and various sizes of boots and other household items. It was no longer a church, but like so many of our churches, it had been closed, sold, and converted into a home. I knocked on the inner door, but there was no one there. Hoping the family wouldn't mind, I decided to stay there out of the snow for a while, but the foyer wasn't insulated, so just standing there, I got colder and colder, and I began to shiver. And that's when it happened. And I know how this is going to sound. But I felt a presence there with me, a presence that felt Christ-like, and it brought me comfort. And then a voice came, not through the ears, but through my whole body. And it said, "Keep the doors open. Keep the doors open." And this scared me. So I left, and I was picked up on the road a few minutes later. This experience on the trail scared me, and I had no idea what to do with it. So I buried it. Like the third slave in Jesus' parable who buried his talent in the ground, I buried the experience for over a year. In that year, Brianne and I had our first child, Isaiah. When Isaiah was 3 months old, we started making plans for his baptism. In preparation for the sacrament, our minister asked us to write a letter for Isaiah to open when he was a teenager seeking confirmation. In that letter, I wrote the words, "Answer when Christ calls you." And the voice in the blizzard came back into my mind. In that moment, my heart told me, and I could no longer ignore, that I had received a call to ministry. I put down my pen, and I walked straight to Emmanuel College, and I asked how someone becomes a minister in the United Church of Canada. All these years later, when I think back on that experience in the foyer of the church that was no longer a church, and I remember the words, "Keep the doors open," in my mind's eye, I can't help but see the doors of Metropolitan Church. I believe that I am called by Christ to be a minister. And for this time anyway, whether it be short or long, I am called to be here. And not in some special way. Our stories are different, and I may have needed a bigger nudge than some, but I'm called in the same way that Jim is called to be here. And Jonathan and Mark and Terry and Malachi and Stephanie, in the same way all of you have been called to be here, even if this is your very first time being here. Christ's call is real. Online and in person, we are each here today for a reason. To be the church and to bring whatever gifts we have been given and to not bury them, but to offer them with faith that God will magnify them for God's good purposes in the world, for beauty, and for justice, and for healing. I've had almost 5 years to consider what the call to keep the doors open might mean for me, for us here in this place. I believe we are called to keep the doors open to the community. In this time when so many churches are closing, I believe we are called to be stewards of this church and to very literally keep those doors open on Sunday morning and through the week for people to encounter sacred space and time set apart to grieve and celebrate and contemplate, to keep those doors open to those who need support, whether it be pastoral care, spiritual guidance, or those who come here cold and shivering, those needing the necessities of life like shoes or food or help navigating systems. And in this new reality for our church, where half of us are here and half of us participate online, being open to the community extends beyond the physical community. To those of you who may rarely or never be here in person, but through the mystical body of Christ are just as important, just as cherished, just as needed to build God's kingdom of love here on earth. I believe we are called to keep the doors open to the community. And I believe we are called to keep the doors open to our sacred traditions, to those cornerstones of the Christian faith that have brought comfort and meaning and identity for centuries. We are hardwired for spirituality, and we need ritual and ceremony and vocabulary to give our spirituality shape and direction. We can be a church for people who love church by keeping faith that what we do here matters. It matters when we sing together and pray together and participate in the sacraments together and tell the old stories together. We do justice and build community, but we are not Amnesty International or a social club. We are a church, and we are here to proclaim Jesus, crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. Christ is revealed again and again in our midst whenever we gather in his name and share in his sacrifice for all that is deep and good and beautiful in this world. I believe we are called to keep the doors open to the community and to our sacred Christian traditions, and I believe we are called to keep the doors open for real and reciprocal relationship with people of different traditions. Our empire-building days are done. We cannot claim to have monopoly on things like truth or spirit or love. We need to be grounded in our faith and have a home for that faith. But in this fractured world also needs us to model the peace we desire and to be in open and respectful dialogue with those of other faiths. And also, here in Canada, I believe that any authentic version of Christianity must include building right relationship between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of this land. Spiritual colonization is still an open wound in the soul of our country and our church, and being a leader church in this country means having the courage to answer the call to be leaders in reconciliation and spiritual healing, even if that takes us to uncomfortable places. There are times when I still question the validity of my call, when I question where that voice in the blizzard really came from. I suppose I will always have doubts that I'm really supposed to be here. And yet, I am here. A kid from small-town Saskatchewan with no religious background, an introvert who doesn't really like public speaking, and yet I ended up here in this pulpit, You can't tell me Christ's call isn't real. You will never convince me that God isn't at work in each of our lives. Faith will feel different for each of us. Ministry will look different for each of us. But we are each here for a reason, and we each have a role to play, gifts to offer, talents to use for the building up of God's kingdom of love. Be brave, friends. Be brave. And keep the faith. Amen.